Is it silly that I'm about to record a four-part essay on the history of sex work and sexuality policing in Nigeria solely because of Nigerian Twitter sex work discourse? And I'm about to do it in my car too because it's so hot in my apartment. If where you are right now is hotter than my apartment, I'm sorry to break it to you, but you might actually be in hellfire. Anyways, on that note, I don't actually know how to begin this essay because I can't believe it's making it out of my laptop into the real world. I thought it would live in my laptop forever, but I'm presenting it now. I present to you guys my four-part essay that could pass for a book on the history of sex work and sexuality policing in Nigeria, uh, dedicated to Nigerian sex workers, of course. This ambitious anthology slash collection of essays seeks to elevate contemporary Nigerian sex work discourse and conversations beyond the rudimentary, denigrating, and dehumanizing realm that it has been relegated to by online misogynistic pseudo intellectuals, Twitter banger boys and girls, and the Nigerian society at large. Not to toot my own horn or anything, these essays are well researched, insightful, didactic. So, on that note, my show is on. Welcome to my show. If you're new to my face and my channel, you're seeing me for the first time. My name is Angela, and I'm just a Nigerian that likes to talk about being Nigerian. And in line with that, I'm mostly expressing anger or exasperation on here. So if that's your vibe, even if that's not your vibe, I hope you like my face enough to stay. You have no choice. And then if you're seeing my face for the second time, which is like most likely not the case, because I only have one other video on Nigerian Trump supporters that I think you should watch, because it's nice and it's good for my pockets too, but yeah, if this is your second time seeing my face, you've seen the Trump video. I guess I'm actually extremely flattered. Thank you. Okay, so now that we're all settled in and acquainted, I guess we can all agree that Nigerians are very funny people. No matter how disunited we are, our hate for certain usually marginalized groups of people is guaranteed to show you how concordant and united we can be. And sex workers happen to be one of those groups of people. Sex work discourse is woven into the very fabric of society. We're talking about it everywhere. We're talking about it in our music. We're talking about it on Twitter, in our news. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry is butting in, and we're going in what seems to be repetitive, unproductive circles over and over again, rinse repeat. Except these conversations are not fruitless. We are reaping in we are reaping and harvesting in surplus to the consequences of these seemingly idle conversations. Yesterday's benevolent, misogynistic quips, yesterday's is not that deep, boons and strengthens today's bold hate crime and femicide. Nigerians insistently, pejoratively call women prostitutes. Ashawo, Olosho, OS, all the variants you're familiar with. Consequently, we have this glaring situation on our hands where woman is almost synonymous with prostitute. And it is from this wonder I draw my thesis and it might provoke you, sorry, that every Nigerian woman is a prostitute. I know some people are like scoring off, they're like, let me leave this place fast, fast. But I'll beg you to hang on. The weight and polarity of what I said is not lost on me. It's a bold assertion and honestly just a really dramatic way of saying sex work criminology is everyone's problem and most importantly a feminist one. That's the point of a quick statement, I guess. It's supposed to be staring. So obviously every Nigerian woman is not a sex worker, but there's this puzzling thing, and it's not necessarily Nigerian trademarked, where every girl, every woman sits on a sliding scale that ranges from suspect whore to proven whore. This tweet also better nails in my point. It reads, and when you as a woman realize that every culture has their definition of prostitute, the woman with her hair out, the unmarried woman, women who live alone, who wear red lipstick, who work, you understand that prostitute means woman and you fight for your liberation. one of my like favorite video essayists, a Nigerian video essayist, political baby, actually spoke excellently about this in the first video of her Love Under Patriarchy series. I'm actually just going to put the clip here.
This is going to be very controversial to say. Marriage also is sex work because a lot of women, what they're doing is women engage in marriage from a place where, okay, he's gonna take care of you financially. And
We're thinking too small. This debate shouldn't be about is it sex work or is it marriage. Rather, it is an entire sex economy that requires, commodifies, and extracts the erotic and sexual labor of all women, irrespective of if they're a wife or a sex worker. Now, within this sex economy, it is a spectrum, a sliding scale in which all women sit on to varying degrees.
So yeah, good women are expected to toe this arbitrary nebulous line of morality to differentiate themselves from the bad women or the whores, but they still get called whores anyways. This essay, my essay, is not concerned with trying to convince people that are not sex workers that they are, or with blurring the lines between marriage and other sexual and erotic relationships and sex work. Rather, I intend to draw attention to the thread that connects us all. In the book Global Sex Workers Rights, Resistance and Redefinition, Kempadu explains that while our approaches suggest that social relations involving sexual labor are not inherently tied to specific gendered roles or bodies, there is a persistent pattern through much of history that positions the social gender category women as the sellers of sexual labor and men as the group deriving profits and power from this interaction. So, in other words, there is a persistent biological essentialization of sex work with women constructed as the laborers and men as the reapers, rendering the word prostitute virtually synonymous with woman, despite the fact that these gendered relations are being contested and redefined in many places around the world. Yes, we have men redefining the sex industry all around the world. We see beach boys in coastal countries selling love to European and North American women. In the US, men are entering stripping and exotic dancing in record numbers and being paid different and better too. Um, in clubs with women under the same management as well. These challenges to the biological essentialization of sex work are underemphasized, and the irony or the lack thereof is that male sex workers, when they finally come up in conversation, when they finally come up in discourse, are accorded more respect than their female counterparts. Um, they are seen as more independent and liberated than their female counterparts who are seen as social deviants, outcasted, criminalized, or worse, killed for it. So a gendered hierarchy and systematic privileging of men continue to be present within the sex industry as with every other industry. So with this, you wonder why Nigerian men in general, and the broader public keep peddling a frankly anachronistic, antiquated, misogynistic, and femicide arousing judgment of the sex industry. If prostitute is synonymous with woman, and we can make the connection between how women sex workers are treated and how all women are treated, then we can conclude that sex workers' liberation is inextricable from women's liberation. If the sex worker is rightless and able to be stripped of their humanity, not much progress can be made with regards to the rights and respect of other women, especially the working class and poor ones. Feminism devoid of sex work advocacy is simply one that centers respectability politics and hinders working class and cross identity feminist alliances. Like I said, men do sex work, are recognized, respected, and properly compensated for it. So, what's the hiccup with women? Now, this is probably a good junction to make the distinction between prostitute slash prostitution and sex worker slash sex work. So far, I have used the terms interchangeably because people do that in legal, political, and everyday situations. The difference is really who is wielding what. Sex workers would use like prostitute slash prostitution to describe their labor activities, while non-sex workers would usually employed more or less like a slur to imply that a crime is being committed. So they construct prostitutes as an identity, a social characteristic of women akin to whore, and is usually wielded to downplay or dismiss sex work as an income generating activity and form of labor for both men and women. So the flattening of sex work to wanton promiscuity is that's what it is, and that is also, however, simply no different from saying that the average waiter is just like someone that's passionate about the food industry. Like, bro, they need to survive. And you know why we'll never actually make that mistake is because we know that it's not true. In reality, we know that workers are way more than their jobs, and that all workers in the capitalist marketplace have complex and contradictory feelings and thoughts about their jobs. So again, I ask why this knowledge is not gracefully extended to sex workers. Sex workers are not any more whores than other workers are wholly and monochromatically their jobs. We all have lives outside of our jobs, or at least we should. We should. Our jobs may or may not echo our values, and our lives on the outside may or may not reflect our jobs too. Unless you're like, I don't know, an arms manufacturer or something analogous, then that does not apply to you. Your job echoes your life. You need to introspect, please. Anyways, with all that in mind, I'll try to use the phrases sex work and sex worker almost exclusively going forward. Sometimes I might sleep because sometimes I might be discussing a source that employs otherwise as well, but I'll try to be conscious in doing that. It's like the most respectful and fitting thing to do. Now let's get into the thick of it. I believe that any opinion it may be that someone holds of sex work can be located under four major conceptualizations of sex work. You really just have to sit down and ask yourself, what is this person really saying? Van der Meulen and Dursin 2018, in outlining Canada's history of sex work regulation, pinpointed the frameworks used in conceptualizing sex work in Canada and the social legal approaches each one carried. I'm borrowing some of that analysis as a lens to view further than Canada alone, because I have observed that all opinions of sex work, whatever it may be, can be located under some of these frameworks, four of them in particular. And considering that each frame has its characteristic social legal approach, I conclude that opinions on sex work are not just opinions, but also a suggestion or support for what is thought to be the right way of dealing with or the right attitude to have towards sex work. And it will become clear in a minute. Just rock with me, okay? So the four frameworks I'm referencing from Van de Meulen and Dursin are the necessary evil lens, the inevitable evil lens, the social evil lens, and the sex work is work framework. Okay. More importantly, we should keep in mind that there is a direct connection between conceptualization and policy. And again, you see what I mean in a minute. Keep on rocking, okay? The necessary evil framework is one that is used to justify the mere tolerance of sex work for the social purpose it serves, that being the satisfaction of men's sexual needs. Hence, through this lens, sex workers are seen as socially useful deviants. There is a long history of people buying sexual services. People say sex work is the oldest profession all the time, even though, well, I don't want to talk about that right now, but people say it all the time. However, most of that history also consists of men's buying of sexual services being seen and encouraged as the natural and ideal order of things. So when people that think of sex work as a necessary evil speak of sex workers, they talk of them like they are socially useful deviants. A very good example of what I mean is this quote from Irish political theorist William Lecky describing a sex worker in his 1869 book, The History of European Morals. That is so ironic. What? Anyways, he wrote, Herself the supreme type of vice, she is ultimately the most efficient guardian of virtue. But for her, the unchallenged purity of countless happy homes would be polluted. On that one degraded and ignoble form are concentrated the passions that might have filled the world with shame. She remains while creeds and civilizations rise and fall, the eternal priestess of humanity, blasted for the sins of the people. Isn't that like the funniest thing you have seen, like you have read in a while? Um, anyways, the quote is very timeless, I want to say, but it's also very Victorian. It's very true to the time because Victorian moralists at the time then saw patronizing sex workers as preferable to masturbation or the seduction of pure women, or even worse, homosexuality. And backed by scientific findings of the 17th and 18th century, the dominant attitudes understood sex work as a safety valve to accommodate the natural overflow of male lust, that is, male lust that could not be contained by the institution of marriage and might, eventually manifest in perversity, or as our friend Lecky described it, passions that may have filled the world with shame if sex workers did not exist. So there was this perceived dichotomy of men as the naturally lustful sex and women as conversely naturally chaste, because women are always the opposite complementary versions of men. So English essayist William Rathbone Gregg in 1850 wrote to this effect. In men in general, the sexual desire is inherent and spontaneous. In the other sex, the desire is dormant, if not non existent. If the passions of women were ready, strong, and spontaneous, in a degree even approaching the form they assume in the coarser sex, there can be little doubt that sexual irregularities would reach a height of which at present we happily have no conception. So there was and still is this idea that men are naturally hypersexual and most women could not keep up, so men had to patronize sex workers. And in accordance to that, lustful women, women that liked to have sex, and sex workers were and are cast as unnatural, perverted, but somehow still serving the greater good, which is containing men's hypersexuality. So people with this stance, people that spoke of or still speak of sex workers like William Lecky and the likes, prop up the legalization approach. Remember, I said every framework has its corresponding social legal approach. So under the necessary evil, the people that think of sex workers as a necessary evil, that sex workers as providing a social good to some extent, they prop up the legalization approach, where governments maintain a high control of the industry. They impose restrictions and policies to mitigate the undesirable aspects of the trade. So they're like, we can't really eradicate you people because people are doing this good thing for us. We are preventing our men from passions that may fill the world with shame. So we're just going to, mitigate the undesirable aspects of the trade. So that's legalization. So the government decides who, where, and how people can participate in the sex industry, and this is the approach. Sorry, yeah, this is the approach taken in places like Germany, Amsterdam, with its famous red light district, and so on. And then the rules are rigorously enforced with criminal penalties if not followed. Um, I'll come back to legalization in a bit more detail later. I don't know how much more later, but soon. Moving on, we have the inevitable evil framework. That's the second framework. And as the name implies, under this framework, sex work is viewed as a vice that is fully that is impossible to fully eradicate. It's like the necessary evil framework in the way that it still views purchasing sex as the irregular indulgence of men's natural impulse, um because again, the under the necessary evil, they're kind of thanking and bashing the sex worker for servicing men that would otherwise turn to perversity. Oh my god. So weird. um but under the inevitable evil framework, they are not praising the sex worker. They're just like, well, men patronize you sometimes because they need to, but like we're not thanking you or anything. So like, again, it still views purchasing sex as the irregular indulgence of men's natural impulse, but unlike the necessary evil perspective, it doesn't credit sex work as producing any substantial social good. Instead, there's heavy focus on the nuisance that supposedly accompanies sex work and the presumed spread of diseases. So here, sex work under the inevitable evil framework, sex workers are often viewed as sites of moral and medical degeneracy. Sex work is seen as a public health problem. The focus, therefore, is keeping sex work as minimal as possible through criminal regulation and punishment. So here, sex work is still legal, but regulation is extremely stringent, so we may see high licensing fees, tight requirements like no criminal records, and other barriers to entry. I'll say this is the approach we see in the US state of Nevada, where sex work is only permitted in certain rural counties outside Vegas. In Austria, and in Austria as well, where you can only work from a brothel, you can't work from your home. Yeah. That is the inevitable evil framework. The third framework is the social evil framework, and this one just combines all of these that were spoken about. So, like the necessary evil framework and the inevitable evil framework, it just combines it in the worst ways possible. So, it insists on viewing sex workers as fallen women, social nuisances, who all at the same time are victims somehow. This framework rejects the tolerance or regulation of sex work solution that previous frameworks advise, and instead calls for the complete eradication of sex work through explicit symmetrical or asymmetrical criminalization. So they're like, no regulation, no like you're legal but only here. We're like, we don't want to see that shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Sorry. Um, Symmetrical criminalization is when everyone involved in the sex trade, from the workers themselves to the buyers, managers, advertisers, anybody in the crossfire, including the workers themselves, bear the burden of criminalization. I believe this is the approach that's seen in most states of the US, besides Nevada, that tails the legalization approach, um, and the city of Chicago, that with the asymmetrical criminalization. Asymmetrical criminalization is also called partial criminalization, is also called the Nordic model, is also called the end demand model. It has so many names. Um, so it's essentially the criminalization of everyone or anyone else involved in the sex trade besides the seller. So the logic behind that is that sex workers are the ace people that peddle asymmetrical criminalization. Their logic is that sex workers are inherent victims and so should not be punished further with criminalization. So instead, the burden of criminalization should fall on those enabling the victimhood. So that's the buyer and the third parties. So remember, it's also called the end demand model. So the idea is that the sex industry can be phased out by ending demand, so by bringing in the police to arrest the demand, essentially. This is the model that is followed in Canada, Norway, Sweden, Chicago, like we mentioned, and in my beloved country, Nigeria. Again, sex workers are under this social evil lens, positioned as victims of something other than the law and the police. So their positions of they're positioned as victims of life circumstances, like, oh, this is just a poor woman that has to do sex work, or victims of biological disposition, victims of evil man, like this evil man is like forcing this woman, is pimping this woman out, or their own bad choices. They're always seen as victims of something or themselves, but never victims of the law, and therefore they need saving. So proponents of this stance, proponents of the asymmetrical criminalization, will often say things like, "I support sex workers, but I hate sex work," because they insist that the harm to sex workers is inherent to sex work, and they refuse to look into how the very anti-sex work policies they champion perpetuate the said harm. And to further cement the stereotype of sex workers as hapless victims, they inadvertently start synonymizing sex work with trafficking, often embroidering it and misrepresenting the facts to suit their narratives. So, when sex workers attempt to set the record straight, then they are called criminals. So, under the social evil lens, sex workers are either victims or criminals. And on par with that, I can't count the amount of times on Twitter, I've seen rad firms calling sex workers pimps or accomplices in trafficking while they're attempting to set the record straight. Meanwhile, the legislative and enforcement measures that the rad firms are supporting unironically reinforce exploitation and all the harms that they allege that they are protecting sex workers from. Okay, so I'm actually going to put a pin in this for now. I'm not going to explain like the sex work is work framework right now. I'm going to kind of do it throughout the body of the work. So like at the end you can piece together and extrapolate what I mean by sex work is work and what all of that entails. I've spoken on three of the four frames. I've spoken on necessary evil, inevitable evil, and social evil, and I've differentiated legalization and criminalization. So really, when someone speaks on sex work and sex workers, you can know and let them know the suggestions that are implicit to their stance. So, like I said, I opine that opinions on sex work are not just mere opinions; they're actually a suggestion and support for what is thought to be the right way of dealing with sex work. So, if you're saying, well, sex workers they're bad, but they're like helping us with men. Yeah, like thinking of sex workers as a necessary evil, which is interesting. You need to examine yourself, your what you're thinking. If you think, wow, sex workers are just spreading diseases, you're thinking of sex workers as inevitable evil. If you say, well, sex workers are victims, then you're thinking of sex workers as social evil, and you're proposing criminalization, be it asymmetrical or symmetrical. Actually asymmetrical for the victims. Symmetrical, they're like, we don't want to hear the victim, everybody will round you up. Okay. I don't know why I'm making light of this. Sorry guys. Don't This is very serious. But yeah, I just want to say there is a social legal approach to everything that you think about sex workers. And what you're saying is a suggestion. Sorry, it's not even a suggestion, it's a support for that social legal approach. Um Now, since the anti-sex work machine carries on in equating sex work to trafficking to the point where anti-sex work policies are tied and inextricable from anti-trafficking ones, it is only right that we do a quick deep surface level dive, so like a quick dive that's deep but also not really deep, into the history of our contemporary anti-sex trafficking movement and how we arrived at what we have today. The primary source for this section is Kamala Kempadu's The Modern Day White Woman's Burden, and it investigates the three dominant perspectives in today's anti-trafficking movement and aptly identified them as the anti-modern slavery, abolitionist feminism, and celebrity humanitarianism. She tells us that while each trend has its own set of actors, agendas, and assumptions about how to eradicate human trafficking, when all put together, there is a remarkable consistency in their politics of race and approaches to the political economy. The anti modern day slavery movement, the first trend, is substantially based on the works of Kevin Bales, co founder and former president of Free the Slaves, which is a US spawn of Anti-Slavery International, which likes to call themselves the world's oldest human rights organization, but it's literally just a British NGO that was originally established to end chattel slavery in 1839 and refused to go out of business since then. Um, this movement, this rather interesting movement, the anti-modern day slavery movement, draws conflation between what they regard as modern day slavery and chattel slavery, flattening the realities of chattel slavery and exposing a fundamental misunderstanding and misrepresentation of how chattel slavery worked. So here's journalist and anti-modern day slavery advocate Benjamin Skinner on an interview with Global 3000 explaining what modern day slavery is. In a humbling turn of events, I actually can't put the video because of copyright issues. So I just copied and pasted the transcript, so you guys have to pause to read. Sorry. By Skinner's own admission, we know that the majority of cases of modern day slavery are situations of debt bondages in which one person works for another to repay a loan. And the reality is that debt bondages, however bad, is a temporary condition that is usually not inherited. It can be because Skinner really honed in on that, how many generations long death bondages can go. But that's not the case usually. Now, chattel slavery, on the other hand, was the ownership of persons and their generations for life by other persons spanning 4 centuries. What is termed modern day slavery today is more genealogically related to systems of indenture used on the Cape colonies and sugar producing colonies of the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean following Britain's abolition of slavery, also known as the coolie system. That system, nevertheless exploitative, was upheld and praised as progressive, civilized, and unlike slavery because, unlike the enslavement of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, death bondages usually involve a level of willingness on part of the victim. They do not involve the kinds of physical violence that kept Africans in slavery. The chains, the whipping, the lynching, it doesn't involve that. It doesn't typically involve that. And events such as kidnappings are rare. Now, even the anti-modern day slavery advocates will occasionally pay mouth service to this distinction. They will say like, yeah, it's different from chattel slavery sometimes, but the word slavery at all connotes chattel slavery. I'm sorry, like the imagery that the word slavery manufactures, the kind of visceral reaction that keeps that the word slavery manufactures keeps the wheels to their business turning. And I'm being literal here. If you look up Kevin Bales, right on his Wikipedia page, in fact, one of the things you see is that investigative journalist Christian Parenti wrote a criticism alleging that he made false claims about the chocolate industry. It literally said, Bales goes around fundraising, flogging his book, and promoting himself on the basis that he has successfully reformed the chocolate industry and largely halted its use of child labor in West Africa. But no such thing has happened. Bales' organization, FTS, defended the chocolate industry when the Department of Labor sought to list cocoa, I don't know, man, as a product tainted by slave and child labor. So, yeah, people can say I'm being too pedantic. What difference does it make? This guy is a decorated human rights activist and professor of contemporary slavery. Yeah, and people say, like, what difference does it make if you call it slavery versus indentureship? I just feel like it's that deep, but maybe that's just me personally. Okay, the second trend, that's the abolitionist feminism that Kamala discussed, does not draw on black slavery abolition in the same way modern day anti-slavery campaigners do. Instead, these abolitionist feminists build upon a history of white supremacist campaigns against white slavery, focusing on the workings of the patriarchy, with an almost exclusive concentration on sexual violence against women. Um, Abolitionist feminism is directly related to the later emerged Euro American school of thoughts we now know as radical feminism. Radfems view sex work unconditionally and without exception as violence against women, bolstering the harmful notion that women cannot consent to sex work. This idea that women cannot consent to sex work circulates widely today, with forced labor and trafficking becoming conflated with sex work, where all prostitution is seen to constitute female sexual slavery. Now, how did we get here, and what is white slavery? To understand that, we need to discuss the OG Radfem, Josephine Butler, aka the patron saint of prostitutes. Why am I smiling? I don't know. This woman is not a good woman. You people should not like let my yeah, she's not a good woman. It was the year 1864, and the British government was very disturbed about the prevalence of venereal diseases, especially amongst their armed forces, both home and abroad. And this was a huge problem. It was one so big, it culminated in the RCVD, that's the Royal Commission on Venereal Diseases, reporting in 1916 that Britain had the highest rates of venereal diseases in the world. Now, in the country's defense, 1916 is wartime, was wartime, and there's something about wartime and STDs that historians can do better justice to. Like, I have suspicions, I have theories, but like I don't know. There's something about wartime and STDs, anyways. So the point is that the problem got so serious that they formed a royal commission in the first place. And shit is getting real when the British start to form royal commission. So yeah, it bugged them. It bugged them so much because an STD problem doesn't speak well of their moral, civilized society, and two, it also affected their troops. Britain always had troops deployed even before World War One, because they were on this trailblazing mission of abolishing slavery worldwide at the time. So they needed their men to not have STDs. They needed their officers to be as efficient as possible, and also the STDs were costing them a lot of money. And when I mean a lot, it was costing them a lot of money. It was costing them manpower as well, and they were barely knowledgeable about the STDs in the first place. Because remember, this was before gem theory, or maybe roughly around the time gem theory was being proposed. Yeah, they did not know much about these things. In response to their concerns, they passed a series of laws known as the Contagious Disease Acts of 1864. That's the CDAs, with the initial goal of stopping the spread of STDs within the armed forces. These acts originally applied only at some naval ports, but soon expanded to cover almost the whole of Britain and much later their colonies as well. So an interesting thing, a fun fact, if you can call it, is that coastal cities, or people from coastal cities, are more likely to be okay with sex work. I don't mean like okay, but like they're more likely to view sex work as a necessary evil because of the presence of, or historical presence of, military and naval officers. We'll see this when we talk about Lagos 2 later in the second video. I'm going to talk about Nigeria, guys. I promise. Anyways, now back to Victorian England. Military men were often unmarried and away from their wives, and masturbation and homosexuality were hugely frowned upon, aka passions that may have filled the world with with shame. Hence, sex work in these coastal cities where the military officers and naval officers lodged, sex work would be considered a necessary evil there for them, and by extension, civilian men as well. So far, the spread of STIs could be contained. Landlocked cities, on the other hand, were more likely to view sex work as a straight up social evil, and that's why the CDAs worked their way down from naval ports and military bases into the rest of the country. With the CDAs being implemented, sex workers, women sex workers, were forced to register under police and medical systems. They became increasingly surveilled and they had to undergo bi-monthly internal medical exams that the women literally described as surgical assaults. And if found positive of any infections, she could be detained in something called a lock hospital until she's deemed clean. And this could take up to a year because, again, they didn't know much about these STIs. And healing meant almost exclusively the disappearance of external symptoms to the doctors back then. So people were obviously and understandably furious at these acts. And one of the points raised in dissent was that there were no such provisions in the act for the sex workers' male clientele. Which is true. And that is because overall, the law was operating through a legalization lens. The CDAs were not instituted to eradicate sex work, but rather regulate the perceived undesirable aspects of the trade, which in this case was the spread of STIs. Another thing about the CDAs was that they did not contain a set definition of sex work, which is also something we see with a lot of contemporary sex work legislation as well. They don't really define what sex work is. So that meant that arrests were entirely left then to the officer's discretion and were not evidence based at all, meaning anybody could be arbitrarily arrested on discharge. And I think we can begin to process how horrible this was, especially for working class women, because all it took for them to be arrested was just an officer suspecting them of being a sex worker, literally. So the annoyed British women, wherefore, took to the streets, and the major movement for the renouncement of the CDAs were underway with the leadership of our patron saint of prostitutes, Josephine Butler. These protests resulted in Britain repealing, repealing the CDAs and replacing them with the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which was somehow worse. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So the movements for the repealation of the CDAs argued that the law's view of women and sex workers as vectors of diseases was wrong. They argued against the view of women and sex workers as vectors of diseases and presented the refreshing, groundbreaking, and never thought of idea and view of sex workers as victims of male exploitation that needed to be saved. The, behold the birth of the Radfair movement. Anyways, Josephine Butler's campaign, advanced the position of sex workers as a social evil, as sex work, sorry, as a social evil that must be eradicated, as opposed to the existing conceptualization of sex work as a necessary evil that should be regulated, with like something like the institutionalization of the CDAs, for instance. So she insisted on the criminalization and complete outlawing of sex work via criminalizing the male clientele and not just mere legalization as Britain had been practicing. On the 6th of July 1885, the Pall Mall Gazette, one of England's leading newspapers at the time, carried the first part of a series titled The Maiden Tributes of Modern Babylon. It was published by editor W.T. Stead, William Thomas Stead, in collaboration with his friend Josephine Butler. This series contained sensational accounts of young white British girls who would otherwise have respectable careers, or even underage girls, in some cases, being seduced, deceived, or forced into sex slavery by foreign born men. This was an instant guaranteed cause celeb because it nailed in Butler's point that sex workers were victims of men, and not just any men, but racialized men, feeding into British society's racist anxieties around the integration of free black people and other minorities into their society post emancipation. The ensuing moral panic and outrage from this publication was, for the most part, the biggest propeller for the passage of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act that repealed the CDAs. The movement was already international at this point, so it did not stop with the scrapping of the CDAs. There was instead more intense lobbying for changes in other nations' laws and for international agreements banning this so-called international slave trade, international slave trade in girls, otherwise known as white slave traffic. The propaganda was now heavy against sex work and predatory, unscrupulous migrant men, forcing and selling innocent white girls, white women into slavery. We consequently saw an influx of several trafficking suppressing laws, some of which are now consolidated into the United Nations 1949 suppression of the traffic in persons and of the exploitation of the prostitution of others acts. Some of the preceding laws to this final consolidation include the 1904 International Agreement for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic, signed by concerned kings and queens of Europe, vowing to combat the traffic of women and girls. The 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic, signed by 13 countries. This convention stated that whoever, in order to gratify the passion of another person, has procured, enticed, or led away, even with her consent, a woman or girl underage for immoral purposes shall be punished. And the second article of the convention prohibited the use of fraud, violence, threats, or abuse of authority to compel a woman or girls into immoral acts, reflecting Josephine Butler's message, by the way. And then in 1912, Saskatchewan, Canada, introduced the Female Employment Act that banned Chinese business owners from hiring a white female employee. Now, all that aside, or all that in conjunction, upon its establishment post World War One in 1920, the League of Nations, that's the UN's predecessor, took over from Britain and aggressively supervised and enforced the international conventions. They pursued global abolition of state-regulated sex work, and the reformers and the activists, that's the British reformers and activists from the repealation of the CDAs, did the field work of harassing sex workers to rescue them, while also vigorously lobbying for increased surveillance of people's sex lives and for racist anti-migrant legislation. These efforts were all married into the UN's 1949 Anti-Trafficking Act with the loquacious name, the one that I mentioned before, the suppression of the traffic of persons and the exploitation of the prostitution of others. Whose preamble states that prostitution and the accompanying evil of the traffic in persons for the purpose of prostitution are incompatible with the dignity and worth of the human person, and endanger the welfare of the individual, the family, and the community. This consolidation reflected prohibitionist conceptualization of sex work as a social evil that had to be eradicated, in making criminal provisions for voluntary sex work as a punishable form of trafficking. Because what do you mean prostitution and the accompanying evil of traffic in persons? Like, it's only prostitution that trafficking used to follow. These acts are signed and ratified by most, if not all, of the member countries, really solidified that dangerous impression of sex work being the same as trafficking. Now, much later, not that much later actually, LOL, but like the 1980s, we get a spur of anti-trafficking movements by sex workers themselves, with legitimate concerns for the working conditions of migrant sex workers. Sadly, these movements were very quickly co-opted and appropriated by abolitionist feminists and religious organizations, and then steered off in a direction reminiscent of early movements or the earlier movements' fear of white slavery. So this new direction that the movement was steered off in became steered off to became even more concerned with the issues of morality, border security, and transnational organized crime, and would be directly responsible for the UN's 2000 protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, also called the Palermo Protocol. Guys, that's the full name. This is, I swear, that's the full name of the thing. Now, of which many of today's anti-trafficking efforts are actually predicated. The 1949 one still exists, but the 2001 is more recent, so I guess it makes more sense to work with that one. This protocol is essentially a neoliberal interpretation of Josephine Butler's movement, echoing half-baked feminist concerns about sex workers' labor conditions, while advancing anti-sex work sentiments by singling out and conflating sex work with exploitation and trafficking again. Now, this is all, oh my god, I can't believe all this was like just the second trend. Guys, I think we have to remember this, we're tracing the three different trends. This is the abolitionist feminists, and this is what the abolitionist feminists have done. So like they're campaigning, the UN is passing, that kind of situation. The third trend that Kempadu identified or pinpointed is celebrity humanitarianism, as named by Ilan Kapoor in his book with the same title, Celebrity Humanitarianism. In this book, Kapoor examines the global charity and philanthropy of celebrities, billionaires, NGOs, and Hollywood stars who, in the past decade or two, have adopted human trafficking and modern day slavery as social issues to speak out against. The main thrust behind such celebrity campaigns and attention is the rescue of women, particularly young women and underage girls, from what they deem to be modern day slavery and sex trafficking. Picking up from the terms introduced by the two aforementioned groups, the anti modern day slavery activists and the rad firms. Celebrity humanitarianism is broadcast widely in the media. The celebrities' hearts are seen to be in the right place, their pockets are deep, their star status can bring attention quickly to a problem that is believed to be one of the most heinous. However, as Haynes 2014 puts it, although a great deal of money and attention are directed to their awareness raising efforts, celebrity engagement is not significantly advancing the work of eradicating human trafficking. Instead, most celebrity activists reduce the complexity of both the problem and its potential solutions to sound bites, elevator pitches, leading the public to believe that doing something, anything at all, is better than doing nothing, when the opposite may well be true. Now, another article, Human Trafficking and Film, How Popular Portrayals Influence Law and Public Perception, outlines the problem with the mainstream or pop culture's portrayal of human trafficking. Looking at Hollywood's portrayal of trafficking, which we should note is distinct from, say, Hollywood's or other non Western depictions and tellings, uh, the paper outlines that whilst human trafficking by definition comprises exploitation of another person through prostitution or other forced labor and services, popular media and mass perception insist on perpetuating and reflecting some recurrent themes. Trafficking tropes, number one, are hyper attentive to sex, effectively excluding other forms of labor trafficking and exploitation. Individuals are trafficked in labor for uh, manufacturing, agriculture, hospitality, domestic service, mining. any industry you can possibly think of. There are people trafficked in fucking perfume making and essential oils, but somehow sexual exploitation gets all of the spotlights. That's what media wants to cover. Two, subsequently, it also puts forth the idea that only women and girls are trafficked, leaving anti-trafficking efforts less effective in actually dealing with the problem because a huge percentage of victims are being ignored. Conversely, there's also the reinforcement of the stereotype that traffickers are usually men, racialized or at least non-American men, especially. Meanwhile, a not so fun fact is that in Europe, women make up a higher share of people convicted for human trafficking offenses than for most other forms of crime. And in general, women play a significant role in trafficking enterprises. Now, we might find out upon feminist analysis that women might just be more prosecuted than their male counterparts. Um, and there might be some hanky panky going on there to why women are higher, or maybe that's just the reality, I don't know. But that's not the point. The point is that the media propagates and diffuses this incomplete, easily digestible dichotomy of male perpetrators versus female victims that the legal system itself doesn't think is true. Like, the legal system is basically saying women make up a higher percentage of people involved in trafficking enterprises, but the media is saying that men are the major traffickers. Now, lastly, and tied to what I have said previously, the overwhelming majority of victims in these media portrayals are almost always white. Finally, one last reference to tie this all together. In the article, Victims, Villains, and Valiant Rescuers, unpacking socio-legal constructions of human trafficking and crime migration in popular culture, Edith Kinney tells us that in popular human trafficking media and tellings, we have the victims, the villains that we have both identified, that's the women and the men, and the valiant rescuers. This is where our celebrities come in. They, and by extension, the general concerned public, are the valiant rescuers. We can't deny that celebrities lending their voice to a cause is a good thing. Their audience, connection, capital make them the perfect candidates to speak up. They also appear less politically motivated than governments and NGOs, and their hearts are it just looks like it's in the right place. So they can help activists gain access to policymakers and donors in some cases itself. So we see celebs in ads all the time. The public responds to celebrity endorsements maybe more and concerningly so than they do to experts. And now this is a good thing, right? But it can go awry very quickly. Celebrities tend to stay away from merely raising awareness, and then they begin to give policy recommendations. And this is particularly bad because they usually have the same superficial and uninformed view on trafficking as the mass public, and the solutions they propose to mitigate trafficking may have opposite consequences. And given that they are not experts, they tend to escape accountability because, yeah, like, who actually sent you to listen to them? But like, at the same time, why are they giving advice, right? Now, even when celebrities are merely raising awareness and not giving policy recommendations, there's a risk of diverting attention from the actual victims or rendering them as one-dimensional victims to fit mainstream narratives of trafficking. And the bleak reality is that most trafficking situations are usually complex and boring. They're not the most dramatic worst case scenarios that are worthy of a Netflix documentary or mockumentary. For instance, many narratives, many media narratives, like, or even just like people telling you stories and anecdotes, like to highlight that children are being abducted for sex trafficking. It's very gutting and scary, but it is simply the most infrequent form of trafficking. But this narrative would have all of the efforts and solutions directed to preventing this type of trafficking that is rare, while other common forms of trafficking will continue to flourish. Additionally, there's also the issue of how these popular figures are going on literal world tours making expensive films and documentaries, potentially siphoning and misdirecting donations away from victims and the cause. Existing scholarship and research highlights that trafficking cases are majority in the mundane and complex. Yet the sensationalist, voyeuristic, exciting accounts are the ones that are frequently highlighted. When the issue is framed as one that is primarily affecting exploited migrant laborers and as an outcome of weak labor protections, and on a deeper level, an issue sustained by white supremacy, neoliberalism, and global capitalism, then it's all radio static. But if we instead reframe it as an individual problem of sex trafficking, child sex exploitation, celebrities begin to flock in, and with that comes all the money as well. Um, as Haynes 2014 puts it, celebrities take up issues that are enticing, simple, fundable, and that feed into the rescue myth. Trafficking for sex is more melodramatic than, say, trafficking for hospitality or agriculture. The truth is that sex trafficking and its related issues are equally horrifying, exciting, voyeuristically, and viscerally appealing. It better entices the audience to want to be rescuers, like the celebrities themselves, making it the perfect issue for fetishism and trauma tourism. And we get the valiant rescuers then uh, going on missions to rescue the victims, women, particularly young women and underage girls, from what they deem to be modern day slavery and sex trafficking. A popular instance of this is when journalist Nicholas Christoph purchased a girl in Thailand for $203 to save her from human trafficking. He published several editorials on how he was moved by her plight, how he was shocked that she chose to return to sex work, and eventually a book and a documentary on his broad victim rescue undertaking, all while completely ignoring the structural factors that caused some of his rescued women to return to their previous lives. The topic of trafficking is a quagmire of conflicting viewpoints. Statistical data are inconsistent. There's disagreements uh, as to what the extent of the problem is. What's the like the disagreements in the definition of the problem, to how best to support victims and how to combat the problem. So when people don't know the data to trust, when they don't know what they should be doing, what they should not be doing, and a celebrity swoops in with bold, sensationalizing claims and reductionist narratives and emotional appeal too, we tend to trust them because, like I said, we tend to trust celebrities. Um, so there we have it. Those are the three trends in contemporary anti-trafficking, or like I like to call it, the three allies of anti-trafficking, because these are the three factions that are rallying for the existing structure and constantly reassuring that criminalization is the best approach, and getting the general public to believe so too. Now, remember, Kempadu told us that while each trend has its own set of actors, agendas, and assumptions about how to eradicate human trafficking, when all put together, there is a remarkable consistency in their politics of race and approaches to the political economy. So, simply put, there is a white supremacist and capitalist thread that connects all of these trends together. Kempadu 2015 tells us that combining the three contemporary trends, we see a neoliberal white chivalrous crusade across the world, born of a moral sense of goodness that shows up the power and subjectivity of the global north, with the developing global south and east as the dumping grounds for helping imperatives involving rescue and charity. I'll confess that the cooperation of these three trends initially confused me and like sparked my interest in this research, because what do you mean celebrities are agreeing with rad firms who are agreeing with evangelical Christians and they are working together with a common interest? Um sure, these three trends unironically guys, intersect, culminating in the anti-trafficking efforts we have today, spearheaded by faith-based organizations, abolitionist feminists, law enforcement, NGOs, and celebrity philanthropists, And what even became clearer to me is the funny thing that these identities can actually all be contained in one person, which like I guess never occurred to me before. And that's what I mean by they actually unironically intersect. As Laura Augustine puts it in her 2012 Counterpunch article, The Soft Side of Imperialism, these people, the anti modern day slavery advocates, the abolitionist feminists, the philanthropists, the valiant rescuers, they all get a free pass to act out fun imperialist interventions masked as humanitarianism. And in fact, the success of the anti-modern day slavery and abolitionist feminist movement is measured by the extent of its international outreach, and this is what Kembadu 2015 effectively terms the white man's burden. Anytime rad firms on Twitter talk about like their anti-trafficking, anti-sex work efforts, they like to invoke the spirit of the women of the global south, because like them talking about the global south really shows their interest in, I guess, alleviating suffering in the world. So again, the success of the anti-modern day slavery movement and the abolitionist feminist movement is defined by the extent of their international outreach, unfortunately. um these campaigns all paint rescues of pictures of rescue and redemption, where Europeans and Americans are positioned as the custodian of poor and working class people, especially racialized women and children, a framing reminiscent of each trend's roots movement. Like it seems like they are doing the back-breaking altruistic work of freeing the world from slavery again. um Now, additionally, and to add salt to injury, these movements will acknowledge global capitalism's role in perpetrating sex trafficking and modern day slavery, because they will mention things like racial and gender inequality and poverty. But it's mere lip service. Don't let them fool you. It's what my Twitter people will call performative. Is phony. As Elizabeth Bernstein, sorry, puts it in The Sexual Politics of New Abolitionism, the solutions advocated for all locate social harm outside of the institutions of corporate capitalism and the state apparatus. The solutions instead and consequently call for more capitalism. For instance, Benjamin Skinner from earlier in the same interview with Global 3000 said more capitalism is needed to bring more people out of poverty, and can also be the most effective tool to bring people out of slavery. I'll literally put the video here. It is at this very idea that these movements um, put forward, the very idea that more capitalism is needed to bring people out of slavery and poverty, right? It is at this idea that Kempadu 2015 then asks, can more capitalism undermine or reverse the power and rapaciousness of transnational corporations that pick up and leave industrial countries with their regulated markets to find the cheapest labor possible, and that use their might to extract relaxations around taxation, laws, and working conditions from the host country, creating slavery-like conditions in the process? Is capitalism to alleviate the damage caused by neoliberal free trade agreements that favor the already wealthy and powerful nations to the detriment of the weaker nations? Is more capitalism really the panacea to the problem of modern slavery and human trafficking? Is it? Also, let's not forget that it's the same capitalism that concentrated almost 90% of the world's wealth in the hands of the top 10%, leaving the masses at the mercy of their charity and philanthropy. This same capitalism produced slavery, racism, colonialism, and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't have any more words. We have come to the end of this video. This one actually went on for a bit longer than I wanted, but one less. it is my hope that I have done a decent job explaining the history behind the current images of sex work and human trafficking in the media and the mainstream. And I've also explained how they continue to prop up particular assumptions or ideas around race, class, gender, nationality, and so on. The two broad ideas I want us to leave with today are that our personal conceptions of sex work and trafficking are not random, they're not unique, and they're not some spontaneous spawnings. There's history behind whatever you think, whatever it is that you think, there's history behind it. And also our globally adopted approaches to sex work and trafficking also have history, and it's not a pretty one, and it's also not a spawning of the 21st century. Is like a step-by-step process on how we got here. And of course, in line with the mission in line with the mission and vision of this channel, I will be linking all of this to a Nigerian psyche in the next video, where I talk about sex work and trafficking in Nigeria. So it's my hope that you people actually tune into that one, because not gonna lie, that was the video I actually wanted to make. I only made this one because I wanted to put all that we'll be talking about in the next video in a larger context, in a global context. So like I'm narrowing down in some upside down triangle kind of situation. And also I'll be using terms like symmetrical and asymmetrical criminalization, legalization, decriminalization. I think I mentioned decriminalization. I didn't actually talk about decriminalization in this video because I skipped the last framework, that is sex work is work, but we'll talk about decriminalization as well in the next video. Anyways, yeah, so again, it's my hope that you guys tune into that video. For now, before you tune into that one, like this one, subscribe, comment. I really don't want like discourse, but like I'm entertaining to like, I really want to hear what you people think, you know. It's good for my pocket, it's also good for my mind. Like I'm genuinely not like, you know, baiting you people. I don't like you get. Anyways, like, comment, Jesus, like, comment, subscribe, share, you know, and so on and so forth. Thank you. See you soon.